Welcome to On Just Terms, the video podcast from Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer, where we examine the shifting litigation and regulatory forces shaping corporate Australia through candid conversations with leaders in the fields of governance, commercial and legal risk, and reputational management. Today, we're joined by the Honourable Michelle Rowland MP, Attorney General of Australia. Since taking on the role in May 2025, the Attorney General has been engaged with a range of legal reform issues, including the next stage of Privacy Act reform and the challenges that artificial intelligence poses to copyright law and broader issues across the class action landscape. Together, we'll explore her priorities for the 48th Parliament and what she sees as the defining challenges and opportunities for Australia's legal and justice system. Attorney General, firstly, a profuse thank you from Rebecca and I for being so generous with your time to join the podcast. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Now, we've had the privilege of interviewing a number of senior guests from the business community, the legal community, and it's probably been remiss of me not to ask them more about their journey to the position that they're in and your elevation to Attorney General. We'd be very grateful to hear a little bit of a reflection on your journey to this point.
Oh, certainly. Well, it's a great privilege, obviously, to hold the position. It's one of high prestige, and to be called First Law Officer of Australia, it's not something I imagined the first day I walked into law school. And it's certainly not one I imagined the first day I walked into Parliament either. So it's always a privilege, and we're 1 year into the second term of the Albanese government, and I think about where I was a year ago, what my ambitions were, and at that time as Minister for Communications, I would have been happy to do two things: hold my seat and to remain as Minister for Communications, which is a policy area that's occupied my life for a quarter of a century. But to have the privilege of serving as Attorney General, I must say it's one where I get up every day excited about the day ahead. And my journey has come through the private sector. I worked for 10 years at Gilbert and Tobin. I had a couple of other smaller gigs working in regulatory affairs. And prior to that, my longest job was 8 years working as a checkout operator in a supermarket, which told me everything that I needed to know, I think, about life, and everything has been a variation on that since. So I like to think my journey's probably encompassed three elements. Firstly, someone from Western Sydney who was very lucky, came from a really stable and supportive family with great teachers, and I had an excellent education, worked hard, managed to get into a role at Gilbert and Tobin, where so many people there have been so generous throughout my career and my life. But thirdly, to become a Member of Parliament and represent the area that I grew up in and loved. That has been, I think, the three components of my journey, and here we are now.
Serving your constituents, do you bring particular learnings and lessons from that to your current role? And if you can say, are there people along the way? I know you've made your opportunities through hard work, but mentors or others who have guided you?
Certainly. And the first part of your question around how does Greenway shape my vision and what I do in this role, it's everything. And I said that in my first address to my department, which was I use Greenway as my barometer. The way you govern in Australia is you need to govern from the centre, and Greenway is a slice of Middle Australia. I learn so much from the people that I represent. And just to give you a few examples, I hold various forums, I hold mobile offices, I'm always interacting with my community. And I remember a couple of years ago doing a cost of living forum about how you can make the most of government services and where to get further information. Someone said, I really don't like how when you're using even your own money, you get charged for it at the checkout sometimes. And I said, that doesn't sound right. And I took it to Cabinet. I was on the Expenditure Review Committee at the time, took it there, and now we have a government policy that's been enacted about getting rid of surcharges. And so I want people who are listening and watching this to know that their ideas are heard. And again, what's the most important part of this portfolio? There's so many important parts, but the most important priority is to keep Australians safe. And conducting forums about scams and making sure people know how to protect themselves. Everyone has a story about how technology has been abused and used against people. So that really guides me around, the technology that's needed to keep Australians safe, particularly vulnerable Australians, be they children or older people or people who aren't as well versed in how to utilise tools and safeguards. That really shapes me. You also asked me about mentors. I mean, the first person that comes to mind, of course, is Danny Gilbert, who has been, I think, not only a giant in legal services in Australia, setting up a firm in 1988, choosing a niche, making that niche go further, expanding to be, such a top-tier firm. But what Danny taught me was not only the importance of a culture and of making sure that people were invested in what they were doing, but just the generosity of the man as well, just how important it is to be generous in your careers. And I also learn a lot going in-house. I really enjoyed long secondments and getting to understand businesses. But I can name check any number of people, but I'll end up leaving people out. Everyone from Angus Henderson, who set up Webb Henderson, to Peter Waters, Gina Cass-Gottlieb, who's now obviously heading the ACCC. I'm incredibly fortunate to have had the opportunity to work with such great people who've shaped not only my core legal knowledge, but also the way in which I approach teamwork, the way in which I approach collegiality, and the Prime Minister places a premium on that too, the collegiality across his ministers. And so I'm very fortunate that my background has given me a really good grounding in that.
Great insight, thank you.
I'm so glad to hear your story about your first job having been a checkout operator. That was also my first job. Yes. And I've always thought everything I need to learn about client service and a lot about life. You really do get that insight, don't you?
I agree, 100%. And I think it's also at a time, I was 14, went out to work, and I worked right through, every school holidays, I would work every day. But to learn not only that independence, but the respect for money and finances. And again, you put yourself in other people's shoes. The people I represent, not only in Greenway, but, the Australian populace, people work hard. People migrated to this country not to lose money. So respecting people's points of view, making sure they've got good customer service. And it also taught me the lesson that I try to teach my kids. It's not about doing great things all the time. It's about doing the little things and doing them well. And that's what people notice.
Well, let's go to your Attorney General role. You've been in the role since May last year. So far, what do you see as your most significant achievements or milestones?
I think there's a couple, and there's a lot that's obviously still a work in progress. But I think the reforms around working with children checks, it's an area that I wasn't expecting to be so involved in. And I think that shows too, what has surprised me about the portfolio is how much it interacts with other portfolios, not only the central agencies like Treasury, Prime Minister and Cabinet and Finance, but this is one that goes across early childhood education itself, within the Standing Council of Attorneys General, there's different ministers who have responsibility for this, be it community services and as well as the different AG departments in the states and territories. But reforming that system, which we had some 10 years ago, a Royal Commission that recommended certain actions be taken, and for various reasons, governments at both levels hadn't acted on them. So being able to pick that up and drive that forward, and let's remember where that was coming from. We had some of the worst the exposure of some of the worst pedophiles in Australia, reform being badly needed there. So getting states and territories to get on board with this, to really take it forward through the Standing Council of Attorneys General, but also this is about technology as well. So getting the governments at a Commonwealth level has skin in the game with our national continuous checking capability. And it's not a set and forget. This needs continuous improvement. So I think that element of keeping Australians safe, establishing the Royal Commission, has been really important following the devastating impacts of Bondi in December 2025. Taking through those laws, some of those toughest laws that we've seen, dealing with the aftermath of that has been really important. But I think also, I talked about keeping Australians safe when it comes to scams. Even some of these areas that, to be honest, when I came into the role, I didn't know existed, like the identity verification services that my department undertakes. That's been really important as well. So I think some of the most important changes have been around keeping Australians safe. That will also be always be a top priority as a government. So a lot of them works in progress, but a lot been done so far in those areas.
And what are your priorities now heading into the 48th Parliament?
Look, I think it will be building on some of that, but also there's some unfinished business in terms of the second tranche of privacy reforms. AI, particularly in terms of copyright in the portfolio, will continue to be bringing up challenges, as you know, across every aspect of society and every government portfolio. But I think there's also, there's a lot to be done in terms of criminal law reform. We operate to a grid that has keeping Australians safe as a top priority, but it's also about the law keeping pace with technology. I reject this notion that just says the law will never be able to keep up, so you should just see how it evolves and then act later on. Representing so many distinguished corporate clients, you will know that there's a time and a place for observation, but also there's a time and a place for intervention, and we should always aim to get that equilibrium as a government. But certainly I think there is an expectation, not only from corporate Australia, but from the Australian citizenry, that we'll always be aware of them and we'll intervene where we need to, but in other aspects, it's important to let innovation develop as well. I think it's finding that balance that continues to be one of the biggest challenges.
We've talked about keeping Australians safe, and that's a nice segue, I think, into an area where maybe that's as important as any other area in cyber security, data security. We've had the first round now of the Privacy Act reforms, some quick wins there, and a second round on the way. I thought I'd just give you an opportunity to comment on where you see those reforms adding value and what your vision is for sort of the next round.
Well, I think there's two parts to that. I think the first is, that first tranche, I think, was the most significant privacy reform that we'd had since its inception, and it came on the back of a really significant review that had been done. And yes, the tort of privacy, we had the bedrock of the Children's Privacy Code, which is now out for consultation. So I think those elements coming from that review are really important. But in the second round, that report was done at a time when AI was not in our everyday vernacular as well. Yeah. So I've said before, we need to make sure that we've got this second tranche of privacy reforms that's fit for the AI age. And we took back feedback that was, it wanted more consultation, I think. So I've been taking the time to consult widely across not only tech companies and firms, but also consumer groups and advocacy groups about what this next tranche needs to look like. So we'll be bringing that forward as expeditiously as possible. But I think the key thing here is to get it right. One thing I've observed is you have the evolution of privacy. Back in the day, we were all prepared to give over our personal information to get a free email. Yeah. And then we all turned around and said, oh, how is this being used to against us, not only in terms of scams, but also everyone's making money off our data except the individual whose data it is. And then we had the rise of the platforms where we're really trying to retrofit different schemes, and we have had to be bold in the way we address some of those harms. We've had the social media age limits being brought in, for example, and greater regulation of the tech sector when it comes to different areas of competition, for example. But I think as we look at how we, there'll be an interaction, I think, between AI, privacy, and technology in a way that we hadn't foreseen to date. And we'll be taking not only advice from our consultations, but also right across the ministry. We've got a number of portfolios that have an interest in this area, and exactly as I said, we'll be looking to find that balance. But I think the key thing here is we're always guided by what's in the long-term interests of consumers.
Yes.
We see it very much as a matter of not only their immediate term but their long-term interests, and that's guided me in the telco sector. And I think it's been a basis for the Trade Practices Act when it was conceived as well. So those principles will remain our bedrock.
And I imagine there's a balance there, isn't there, between the primacy of individual rights and protecting individuals and sort of the practical reality that the economy traps data, and sometimes that's necessary.
You're absolutely right. And we are very mindful as a government about the impacts on business, but also consumers have very legitimate expectations about how their personal information is collected, used and disclosed. And to that end, again, just to give another shout out to the Children's Privacy Code. I mean, that is recognising that there is a particular cohort of people who are vulnerable in our community, and we're on to, I think, our second generation of digital natives now. I think we've got the opportunity to do something that is in their long-term interests by having this Children's Privacy Code. And of course, we want the economy to be able to, we want this to be workable as well.
With AI, copyright's another issue because, of course, our laws were created at a time where it was humans that were the creators. What challenges are you seeing in the area of copyright in the age of AI?
Well, I think the first thing when we note the challenges, I think we should take succour in the fact that this is a robust piece of legislation. Like, copyright has stood the test of time. And there's various dissertations about how can something be copyrightable if it's not generated by humans, how much is generated by humans, how much it might depend on prompts and other inputs, for example. But I have great confidence that our Copyright Act is robust. Deals are made. It's been able to solve everything from the rise of Napster 25 years ago. And, so I have confidence in our system of copyright. But I think it's also important for governments to provide certainty, which is why towards the end of last year we made it very clear as a government that we were not going to introduce a text and data mining exception. But we continue to work through these issues with our copyright and AI reference group through my department. And I think that that's an ongoing role. It goes back to what I said about this is not set and forget. Sometimes the role of government is to make sure that we can bring parties together, that we can encourage and incentivise deals. We even saw that recently with our announcement of consultation on the news bargaining incentive, which built on the news media bargaining code regime that was previously in place. I think there's an important role for government to be incentivising these deals as well. But the challenges will be there, be it across workplace relations, be it across the safety aspects of it. But as law firms, we are experiencing, and we're seeing that now, that there's challenges in everything from, back in the day, you would learn a certain set of skills from doing a long due diligence and discovery. Back in the day, you didn't have the high number of unrepresented litigants that we're seeing in the federal court right now. You're not seeing hallucinations. You weren't seeing hallucinations that were happening with court documents being handed up. So I think the real challenge, I think, is again getting that those benefits of innovation, but also the efficiencies that it can drive. I've issued an edict to my department and all of my agencies to to look at how they can better utilise AI. Just to take an example, we had our National Access to Justice Partnership, a $4 billion investment, the single largest Commonwealth investment in community legal services and legal assistance overall. But how do we drive those dollars further by making sure that AI is being utilised in a way that's encouraging that accessibility? And on that point, I must give a shout out to our corporate law firms who do a remarkable job in pro bono. The only time I used to go to court at Gilbert and Tobin was as a volunteer lawyer assisting in the Downing Centre in domestic violence cases. That's the only time I appeared before the bench. So a shout out to everyone in your firm and right across the profession who is putting in the hours, because without that, we would not have the access to justice that we have now. Of course, it can always be improved, but it's better for their input.
It is incredibly important that we do that, and in fact all our lawyers are desperate to participate in pro bono. It's something that really resonates. Can I just ask, from a creator's perspective, I was reading overnight Taylor Swift was doing some moves to get protection in her image and not be able to have AI replicate her. From an Australian creator's perspective, is the government thinking about how to protect in this changing world?
Absolutely. It's one of the reasons why we wanted to give that certainty by ruling out the text and data mining exception. But I also think that, Australia's creatives are really the lifeblood of our culture, and something I've been very conscious of in my previous role as Minister for Communications as well. We're a small market. We have had rules in place over decades to protect Australian content, but also to make sure that it's got every opportunity to thrive and be exported. And I think without those protections in place, it does mean that we really risk not only creatives in terms of artists, but also public interest journalism as well. The fourth estate is so important for our democracy. But we're really alive to it. And again, there's initiatives across portfolios, including the news bargaining incentive that specifically go to that. But I think the key here is that if we did not have protections in place, if we did not have these initiatives, what would that mean for our creative sector? And again, I have great confidence in our system of copyright. I think the answer is not always to rush to new laws. It's utilising the ones that you have well, adapting them, whether they be in copyright, whether they be in privacy, for example. But also it's the collaboration across government in non-legislative interventions that I think are really important as well. And that's something that the Prime Minister places a premium on, the collegiality between ministers who are able to work together and achieve outcomes.
Perhaps a brief diversion into an area close to my heart, which is class action litigation. Possibly one of the more prolific forms of civil litigation in our system at the moment, discharging an important role, also controversial in its own sense. Without asking you to go ahead of where policy is at, I wondered if there are areas of class action litigation that might be explored as potential areas for reform, or how the government's approaching that species of litigation.
Certainly. And look, we're very much alive to the fact that this is an option for people who may not have any other recourse. And it really is a key platform now for access to justice, has been since 1992. So we continue to consult widely across the commercial sector, law firms, but also, again, advocacy groups around how this can be improved. So we're exploring a variety of options. we settled the largest class action litigation in Australia's history only a few months ago with robo-debt. And I think there's a number of areas there we're taking advice and very keen to hear people's views. But I think underpinning all of that is making sure that whatever is done, the interests of the consumer should be at the heart of it. But we recognise how important it is as an option for people who might otherwise not have any other course for redress.
Now, you've been very generous with your time, so perhaps we can close our interview with a forward-looking question about the future. If you were, as you do, your mandate allows you the opportunity, I guess, to prioritise areas of potential reform more important and more urgent for Australians. The question is, where do you see your focus being drawn over the next period of time? What are the areas of reform more generally that you'll be thinking about? And a related question, do you have optimism about the way the Australian legal system is rising to the challenges we're facing now, new challenges that we haven't had to confront before, particularly around data and privacy?
No, certainly. I think in terms of the immediate reform challenges, there's a great deal of work to do in terms of that technology space, because it overlaps with criminal laws, for example. How do we make sure not only that the laws are fit for purpose, but they're also capable of being enforced? And one of the learnings that I've taken over the past 12 months is the importance of our Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions. You can have all the best laws, but if you don't have the enforcement and you don't have the prosecutions capable of being brought, then you're not realising its full benefits. So I thank everyone who steps up to serve in not only the CDPP but also across the AGS and across the department, because they do such an exemplary job. And I guess to give some insight into why I'm concentrating on the CDPP, I look at how some 20, 30 years ago, some of the most work that was done by the CDPP was around fraud against the Commonwealth. Now it's much more of a community safety focus. It's drugs, it's terrorist offences, it's child pornography and child exploitation. It really is going to areas of community safety much more than what might be described as more passive crimes against the Commonwealth, which are obviously important, but it's really been overtaken by community safety concerns. So making sure that they are equipped, I think, is a key challenge. I think in terms of technology and the law being able to keep pace with that will continue to be a huge focus. And I think in 12 months' time, we're going to look back at these conversations we were having about AI, and we're going to say, those challenges, some of those challenges are still there, but I think a lot of them, they'll be evolutionary more than anything else. So I think our responses to that will reflect that reality. In terms of optimism for the future, again, I take a lot of guidance from my electorate, and the calibre of young people in Australia, I think, is one that should never be undersold. I get the opportunity to meet with so many young people who, young kids. I meet with older people who are looking to start studying or take up a career in law. And these are smart people from diverse backgrounds who are really invested in the future of this country. I think the level of awareness and the savviness, these young people are smarter than I ever was at their age. And that fills me with a huge amount of confidence. Even, I've had the privilege of making a federal court appointment and an FCF COA appointment in recent months, and the calibre of people who are stepping up to serve in those roles is outstanding. Appointing Dr. Ruth Higgins as the new Solicitor General, the first woman to serve in that role as well, and I think she has been universally met as being and received as being so qualified for the task. So I guess this is my way of saying I have tremendous confidence in the people who are coming through our legal system. Australians are patriotic, they want to serve, and I encourage people who are in the legal profession to think about how they can serve their country in different ways, because we've got incredible talent, and I think people who are invested in this country's future, and that gives me great hope.
Well, it's a very positive note to conclude our discussion. Can I just extend our sincere thanks? It's not every day we get to have insights from the Attorney-General, so thank you so much for that. And Rebecca and I wish the government every success in executing on its agenda. So thank you again.
My pleasure, thank you.
Thank you for joining us for our discussion with the Attorney-General. One theme stood out clearly. Australia has reached a pivotal moment in its legal reform agenda at the intersection of AI, technology and privacy, and the pace of change shows no sign of slowing. The Attorney-General's perspective highlights the breadth and ambition of what is on the parliamentary agenda. Further Privacy Act reforms through to the novel questions that AI and copyright raise. Against that background, class action risk continues to evolve, with law reform prioritising the protection of individuals while keeping pace with the evolution of technology. We've seen that delicate balancing exercise at the heart of many of these reforms, weighing the protection of individual rights with the practical realities faced by businesses in corporate Australia. The outcomes carry real and immediate consequences for how organisations govern themselves and continue to manage class action risk. Thank you for joining us on Just Terms. We look forward to continuing the conversation as class action risks continue to evolve.